This is an RNZ podcast. Let's talk politics. Brigitte Morten and Tracey Martin. Kia ora, good morning.
Kia ora.
Morten.
Brigitte, Managing Director of public and commercial law firm Franks Ogilvie, a former senior ministerial advisor for the previous National-led government, also a National Party member and currently volunteering for Hutt South MP Chris Bishop. And Tracey Martin, former New Zealand First MP and from 2017 to 2020 a Minister for Children, Seniors, Internal Affairs and Associate Education. Currently she is the Chief Executive of the Aged Care Association. Right, where to begin? Let's begin with the National Party list, which came out over the weekend, and also taking a look at that in conjunction, I suppose, with the latest polling. Brigitte, where does this leave some of the high-ranking national electorate MPs and indeed list MPs, do you think?
Well, I think we're showing in the polls that actually it's stabilising, if not going up for National as well. So I think it's a little bit too early, even though it's, 88 days or something like that until the election, to actually be saying with certainty about who's in or out based on the list and the polling. I think the conversation that's been realistic for a while is that National will lose MPs. That I think is probably certain from that. I think that means there is not so much, I think, the senior MPs that are more in question, Nicola Willis, Chris Bishop, Paul Goldsmith, Jerry Brownlee, they've got winnable list positions. I think when you look at the list, what you're more concerned about is actually where's the next generation coming from? And I think, they've highly ranked Nancy Liu, who is a fantastic MP, highly regarded, I think, across the House, and I think a really good addition. But I look at some of those other MPs who are at risk of not, retaining their seats and not having a list. Greg Fleming in Mangakiki, I think he's a really strong MP. Mike Butterick over in the Wairarapa, strong rural voice. Those are more that I think the concerns about actually if they don't hold on to their seats, what happens to that kind of next generation.
Yeah, Tracey, what's your view of this? Because, on the face of it, potentially, even if you're very highly placed on the list, if you're list only, you could be at risk.
Yeah. Excuse me. One, I think it's a good thing. I think if you want to represent the people of New Zealand, you should have to fight for it. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a plus, okay? I think being a little bit uncomfortable is a good thing. Put your best self forward and campaign. I think, there was a red wave and then there wasn't. So it was always going to be a swing back, right?
The tide comes in, the tide goes out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think what's probably more noticeable now is that it's not swinging between the major parties. It's actually dissipating across some others. And yeah, I think there are some, really solid, nice people who have been, and I live in the Wairarapa, who are going to be really challenged this electorate because there are some good candidates standing there who've showed their chops in Parliament. So, this is the way politics works. Do your best. Don't take it personally. Things like this happen, but it's really hard to find another job next. So make sure you don't upset a whole lot of people.
on the situation with the polls as well, we talk a lot about the knife edge, skin of their teeth, all that kind of stuff. It looks like the coalition holding on at this stage. The poll of polls and the Herald certainly saying the opposition has a 3% chance of forming the next government. Is the big elephant in the room, well, we don't know how big it is, opportunity in all of this, Brigitte?
Yeah, there's definitely some electoral mass that has to happen that, the poll of polls I don't necessarily think reflects because it can't really take into account, I think, the Opportunity Party, but also what's happening in the Māori electorate seats as well, how that's going to flow through in terms of Labour to Party Māori, the independents holding certain votes there. I think
And notoriously hard to poll those electorates
absolutely,
as well.
Yeah. And so I think that's really going to be the sort of where we're actually going to be looking at election night to actually see how that falls out in terms of what seats are being picked and what's not. I think there is definitely, it's looking like a more stable coalition of the willing on the right at the moment, which I think is going to help with their polling overall. I think the problem you've still got on the left is that Labour Greens might be seen as a credible kind of coalition. Labour Greens to Party Māori, maybe Opportunity as well, is a quite confused coalition. It's really unclear actually what those policies are that you'd get under that government.
I don't know that I would have said it looked like a stable right, to be perfectly frank. Look, they haven't even started campaigning. I know it feels like we're already sick of it, the toing and froing, but they actually haven't even really started campaigning until they rise on the 24th of September, and then they throw everything they've got at it, particularly knowing how close it is. I don't think we're going to see. I think we're going to keep seeing this seesawing back and forward. So, put your money down and then just hold your breath, I think.
Do you think the momentum is going to build and hold for opportunity to get over that 5%?
I think that's a really interesting question. I think why have people shifted to a completely brand new party for the first time in a very, very long time, and given them what looks like the opportunity to get over the threshold, and where are they bleeding it from? So if New Zealand First is actually, taking Nationals votes, obviously opportunity must be pulling it out of Labour. So what will Labour do between the 24th of September and so on to try and turn that dial down? Because if opportunity only gets 4.9, doesn't matter, does it?
Yeah. I think with opportunity, I think we can tell from the polls that it is coming out of Labour and the Greens. So it is coming off that left vote. And I think the problem for Labour is that they've tried to play small, which has kind of kept them quite safe, I think, up to this point. But when they're actually sort of bleeding votes off to a party that is putting a lot of policy out there, that strategy doesn't necessarily work anymore. They've actually got to, if they want to be seen as the alternative government, it's not good enough to just park with us, we're better than the other lot. They've actually got to demonstrate why they need that vote more than opportunity does.
A lot of polls of various kinds around. Another one that caught my eye was the Stuff poll, which was showing that a majority of voters think that Christopher Luxon should sack Winston Peters. This is after the comments that he was speaking about as being racist. That was what the Prime Minister said about the comments that Winston Peters said in the House. Tracey, I have to ask you about this one. Especially as well when Christopher Luxon then said, let's have a crack at MMP as well, and we'll have no numpties or yahoos around the table.
Yeah, no, it's been interesting, hasn't it? Interesting couple of weeks. First of all, I just want to, put on the record, I've got nieces and nephews that are third generation New Zealand Chinese descent and seventh generation New Zealand Pākehā descent. They get language like that is used at them on a daily basis in this country. So to have a senior politician use language like that in the House and receive no censure and receive no punishment or no outcome, I find, what would the word be? I find it incredibly disappointing, which is my political language for it.
What's your non-political language for
No,
it?
you couldn't say it on RNZ. Yeah,
there you go. But that tells you, right?
Yeah, exactly. So then we end up in this situation where you've got the Prime Minister who says, I have confidence in the Foreign Minister, but at the same time, the same human being that is the Foreign Minister makes racist comments, particularly about an individual who is a New Zealander of Chinese descent, one of our largest trading partners. Well, I went back to have a look. I spent the day with Winston on the day that he was phoning back and forth with Helen Clark, 71 days before an election, when he was also a Minister of Foreign Affairs. And that time, the relationship between the Prime Minister and her Foreign Affairs Minister, he stood down. Now, I don't know what happened in that room, but I don't think Winston would have necessarily done that 100% voluntarily. And it was 71 days out from an election, and the world didn't end. So I just think there's some really interesting leadership comments around that.
I think what's that incident has taught us is two things. One, you shouldn't trust a polling question that just asks something outside of any context. Because I think if the question had been, if the government was to fall, if he was to sack Winston Peters, would you support it? I think the numbers would have been different. There'd still be a high contingent that we said absolutely this behaviour is abominable, it's not what we abide by in New Zealand, therefore he should go, and be it if that's early an election. But I think for a number of other people, they've gone, well, actually, it's not that long to go. You've got to go out and campaign on this. And I think this is where Winston has actually misstepped on this one. I think he has taken it further than most of his party base would have gone. And I've used this, my own sort of anecdotal polls, talking to older members of my family who I would say would possibly be open to sort of some of the messages that New Zealand First puts out there. This is the kind of behaviour that they actually don't abide by, and that has actually put them off voting for New Zealand First. So I think it'd be really interesting to see how that actually reflects in the polls over the coming month.
But you have to take this into if National and New Zealand First and ACT are still saying re-elect what is the current group because it's stable or it's this, that and the other, this does matter how Christopher Luxon, how the Prime Minister responds. Because if you're going to have to work together for another 3 years are we going to see this same behaviour for another 3 years? If Winston hasn't been pulled in now, will it be okay to do it in the first year?
Well, it seems almost that he's been running from opposition the whole of the time that he's been in government this term.
Well, Winston is a very good opposition MP.
I wonder as well, though, with the context of the last 10 days or so for Christopher Luxon in terms of his communication, catching his caucus off guard with the MMP comments that he made on News Talk ZB last week. I see that the whispers around his leadership have resurfaced again. Jamie Ensor in the Herald over the weekend, Richard Harman this morning in Politic. More talk again of the caucus split. Is he going to survive to the election?
I think he will, and I think the issue is that most people don't want that kind of mess and drama. And the problem with the MMP comments last week is that they were not reflective of actually what people were talking and caring about, which is cost of living and the economy. That's the problem with those comments, not so much catching the caucus off guard, although that, it's a discipline that he, I think he's apologised for this morning.
It looks messy. It looks messy. And it's embarrassing,
but actually
right?
it's the issue is the fact that it's actually not something that people are worried about in their households at the moment, and you've got to use every bit of air you can during a campaign and leading up to the election with things that actually talk to your voters and who you actually want to listen. So I think that's where we've actually had that sort of main issue around that MMP. I don't think it points to a leadership challenge. I think, that's largely been driven as a bit of a media beltway issue. I think, there's been a number of questions about, Chris Hipkins' leadership. I think everyone's sort of surprised that we're having a Chris versus Chris election, I think, again. But this is where we're at, and I think that's probably where we're going to be on election day.
Yeah, it came from nowhere, didn't it? Nobody's... When you look at the amount of New Zealanders who are voting for non-major parties, I don't know why you would assume that anybody else wants to actually talk about undoing MMP. Of course we get frustrated, but there are enough of us who remember why we voted MMP in. So you're right. Look, leaders say things off the cuff all the time that suddenly as an MP you've now got to figure out how do you stand for it in the public meeting you're about to walk into. But this one was just, it was, I'm going to use the phrase tone deaf, and I mean it with the greatest respect, but it is not what people are talking about. We don't need to spend time and money on this particular issue.
We're talking on 9 to Noon this morning, politics with Tracey Martin and Brigitte Morten. And Tracey, I'm interested in your take particularly on why what people talk about as being the purple vote, the National and Labour combined vote, why that is dropping to these historic lows. What is it about the minor parties that people are finding so appealing this time round?
Well, I would have to say, I guess it depends what it is, because each minor party still has their own clique, right? I think it's pretty obvious that New Zealand First has gone for groups of New Zealanders who couldn't find anybody to represent their views anywhere else. So it used to be, the older demographic. Now we are talking about those that were disenfranchised during COVID, the anti-vax movement, the very solid family first sort of movement and so on. And they can't find anywhere else to go home. The Greens have a solid base about what they do. So why is the majority of people splintering off from what are the key tribal messages that they've always had from National and Labour? And it can only be because the message is now confused. Does National still stand for farming community, business community and so on? Think about a recent business meeting that we just has been in the news. Does Labour still stand for workers and so on and so forth? So maybe the crisis of identity is actually in the two majors, and they need to sit down and get back to basics that they keep telling everybody else to get back to.
Yeah, Brigitte.
I think we've seen this across all sort of Western democracies in terms of the major parties. You've just got to look to the UK, you've got to look to Australia. They're having exactly the same debates there and exactly the same reflection in their polling. I think one of the biggest things has been the effect of COVID and the loss of trust in institutions. We've seen that across media, but we've seen that across government as well. And whilst we spend a lot of time talking about the differences between the blue and red teams, the blue and red teams for most people just represent the government and the people in Wellington who are making the decisions. So there's ultimately, I think, that mistrust. I think there is much more scrutiny of Labour and National than there is a lot of these minor parties. People tend to, as Tracey's pointed out, attracted to those parties on a particular thing they've said. So it might be, say, the anti-vax for New Zealand First. So they've gone for it, but they don't actually necessarily look at the wider policies, nor is there enough scrutiny kind of, I think, of some of those other kind of key messages. I think about the Opportunity Party, for instance, the surprise that some people, and I call kind of Wellington the heartland of the Opportunity Party. In Wellington, I think about 10 days ago, when Stuff started talking about the fact that actually they're planning major cuts to the public service, 60% to MSD's budget, 23% to justice. That's not in line with, I think, what a lot of people thought Opportunity stood for. And so I think that kind of scrutiny and things doesn't actually necessarily apply. If National Labour had announced those numbers, can you imagine what would be happening? There would be protests in the streets.
Absolutely. On this, though, you talk about Labour running a very small campaign. I know we're not quite in campaign season, but how annoyed will they be that they did actually announce a policy the other day, but it was the day of the MMP comments, so it got completely buried. With that, the small business plan sort of versus the investment boost, is it a success they're shooting for there?
I think you've got to look at it what it is, which is basically that they've got a big funding gap. The biggest kind of level of funding that they could find, that they could move around, was an investment boost, because it is a good chunk of taxpayers' money that is being spent on that. So when you actually look at that business policy, and as a small business owner myself, I originally sort of looked at the headlines and I was like, oh, that actually seems like something that would be quite attractive. You dig down into it, yeah, maybe we can get a kind of a cheaper laptop, basically. But actually, it's mostly about taking $5 billion out of investment boost and using it for non-business things. The difference between the two policies, I think there's a $1.5 billion. So it's quite a difference in sort of numbers. So I don't think they're going to I don't think they're really trying to win over that small business vote so much with that policy. It's mostly about moving some of the cash around so they can spend it on some of their other policies.
And Tracey, what is your read on, so far, the sorts of policies that Labour is putting forward? Is it far too timid and incrementalist?
Well, I think they're keeping their powder dry. I think, how you mentioned about, that they'd been quiet or small campaigns so far. They're very much on the ground. So they're moving quite a lot on the ground. And New Zealand First used to do that too. I've got to say, for me, for the Wairarapa, I haven't seen anything from the National Party yet on the ground. But Labour is out there in droves, right? So
doing a lot of door knocking.
Yeah, a lot of door knocking, a lot of signing people up to vote, so on and so forth. So that's a thing. But it was something that Brigitte just said then about a funding gap. And quite rightly, she also said just before that about that the major parties get much more scrutiny than the smaller ones. So if I think about what New Zealand First has promised to fund, and if that is the deal of stability going into the next election, who's doing the numbers to actually add up what all the supposed right and supposed left blocs are promising and figuring out where they're getting their money from?
On that, I suppose, as well, is there a greater level of scrutiny that's applied to perhaps some of the younger players in that minor party area, like Opportunity, as opposed to some of the others, the Greens, New Zealand First, ACT, who've actually been at the table, if not in cabinet, in government, and everybody knows that there will be things that they say but won't become bottom lines when you actually go through to coalition talks. Yeah,
the trade-offs.
They've been through that process.
The thing for me, I suppose, about Opportunity, so you're asking whether, so they're new on the block as opposed to younger people,
yes,
you mean, as
newer,
opposed to
a younger
political
political movement.
Yeah. I think, what is it? It's the ideology of it that you get the edges knocked off once you've been in Parliament for a while, right? And you realise that everything is a compromise. So how do you hold on to your base values but actually work with others to get the outcome that you need? And so I think at the moment, and I had a meeting with Q not that long ago, there is a level of realism there, but there's a very strong... there's a lot of people working on policy for them. I'm not sure how many people actually understand politics.
A quick word, Brigitte, around some of the school subjects that have been announced. What was your take on this, and where are some of the teachers going to come from? These new industry-led subjects.
I think this industry-led subject is absolutely the direction we need to be going in. It's actually reflective of what students are interested in. And we know if students are interested in the subjects, they're much more likely to engage with them and actually learn. And I think also it's reflecting what the industry is talking about as the needs to come through into the system. I think, when we talk about teachers, that's always an issue. And as someone who used to, advise the education minister, it's a line, frankly, that the unions will always run out is, we don't have enough teachers, we don't have enough resources, and that's absolutely fine for them to be doing. I don't think it talks particularly to this specific policy that this is an issue here. I think actually we've got a lot of industry knowledge that can fold in. We actually can bring in a lot of people into the classrooms that are not necessarily qualified teachers to actually supplement some of that learning. There's a lot of innovative ways that you can deliver education now that doesn't have to be solely relied on one teacher that's been to training college standing in front of you.
Well, and this, sorry, I just want to jump in there.
Yeah.
Because, that's true. Everything Bridget said is just true. So we could be running clusters of 15 students and beaming them out in front of somebody who's got 5 or 10 other schools doing the same thing. For me, what it comes down to is, what is school actually for? And are we going back to what was an industrial era sort of thing where we're training people for jobs, as opposed to education is supposed to give you the capacity to participate in society, to get employment, all those other things, and create. So I personally thought the vocational pathways was a better, smarter way to introduce young people into what is the spectrum of skills and available employment opportunities with those skills and with that thought process than popping in, we're now going to teach you how to do, care.
Speaking of care, Tracey, you want to have a word about Ingrid Leary's bill on retirement villages. Tell us a little bit about this. Quite a lot of, understandably, a lot of strong public support for it.
Yeah. It's a petition that was on. I don't represent retirement villages, just so we know. So I represent about 100% of those who provide aged residential care. So I only just got involved in this recently when the petition was placed on the steps of Parliament and the Labour Party took it in. One of the things that I've had to try and make sure that people understand is that over the last decade, governments have decided that they will let private businesses cross-subsidise for the creation of aged residential care. So if we interfere with that cross-subsidy, and that's a choice every government has to make, we need 12 to 15,000 more aged residential care beds. If we get in the way of that cross-subsidy, government's going to have to step in. So people need to price that out. And those are the conversations I'm having. And there's always time to change ledge. There's always time to get the point across at select committee and so on. It's just, it's a rising topic and they're competing now over this topic, and people don't really understand what the possible consequence is of shifting these goalposts at the last minute.
Yeah, Tracey is absolutely right, because what we're really talking about here is interfering in private contracts between people who were fully informed adults about what the contract they were signing for their housing, interfering in those contracts to give them a greater benefit than the contract gives at the moment, at the risk of the fact that we've got this huge demand on aged care places, and whether those businesses are sustainable. And I don't see from Ingrid Leary's bill or any of her rhetoric about actually whether or not the Labour Party's actually modelled out how much more money we will have to actually put into the system to make sure we've got enough beds for the older people in our society, in our community. At the moment, we've got to have those contracts. If the market is demanding that, you get your money back sooner, all those kind of things, those are things that actually should be negotiated. I think there's some other stuff that's happening about, possibly independent complaints processes, those kind of things that great conversations to be having. I think the interference in private contracts between fully informed adults is a concerning intervention if that's what the Labour government is planning on doing.
Certainly a conversation we're going to need to increasingly have as the population ages.
Definitely.
Thank you both very much. Lovely to talk to you both on this today. That was our political commentators, Brigitte Morten and Tracey Martin.